So thanks everyone. If you're just tuning in now, I'll give it a couple of minutes for you all to join. So hi everyone, and welcome to the photography show and the video show in this virtual session. Today we have award-winning photographer Andrea Jones with us, who's going to be showing you tips and techniques for great garden photography. If anyone would like to ask Andrea any questions, please put them in the chat comment box on YouTube, and we will be directing all them questions to Andrea at the end of the session as well. So thanks so much for joining us today, and Andrea, I will hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. That's wonderful. Well, I'm really honoured to be here today, especially because it happens to be World Photography Day. And the reason that it's World Photography Day, just in case you hadn't already clocked it, is that Louis Daguerre actually announced to the public this day in 1839, I believe, that he had invented his technique. Not one necessarily to be copied that quickly, because it was quite a lethal concoction of chemicals to use. So, but it was the beginning of photography. And this year, apparently, Photography Day has a theme, which is transcending the plants and gardens are really quite a good place to be, and photographing the subject, as they do actually present themselves in all continents of the world, even in actual fact in Antarctica, where there are no trees or shrubs, but there are two flowering plants, one Antarctic hairgrass and one is pearlwort. So I haven't yet been there to photograph them. I think we should slightly slow down with the pictures, if you wouldn't mind, Sophie. If you could sort of just go back to the first one, thank you very much. Because what I was going to say was that very often, I suppose the aim of my photography is not just to photograph the garden as a whole, and then the details and the horticultural side of the garden, but also to capture a sense of place and atmosphere. I love photographing in all weathers, and mist is one of my favourite elements that I enjoy using for photography. Normally, I rely on all weathers and natural mist fog, but in this case, as you might, shot is in a more exotic location, and it was in fact the last shoot I did before lockdown, which is in Bangkok, of a garden designer's private garden. He's a designer himself, and his partner horticulturalist, both very talented couple. And they actually got out some dry ice for me on this occasion, so that we could play with the lighting and with the mist effect, because it's unusual, obviously, to get this sort of weather in Bangkok. It is near the equator, so therefore you get a very limited amount of light, which is soft. It's usually quite a hard light. On this occasion, there was another element which got in the way, or you could have used to your advantage, which was pollution. It was extraordinarily thick at that time, which is January last year, January 2020. So I will own up to the fact that this was actually dry ice, but there was a hanging thickness of cloud in the air, which was full of particles. So it gave a particularly interesting look, but it wasn't for good reasons, unfortunately. Okay, so we can sort of roll on to the next couple of using very, very early light here for a little cactus collection that was in that particular garden. And with, as I say, photographing in an environment which is near the equator, you've really got a very short span of time to work in. Dawn and dusk, where the light is soft, otherwise it's very harsh and contrast. And for the camera and for the plants and for the detail and the colour, that soft light is really rather important. So moving style of the plate, in this instance, was very important. So the style of the designer, who very flamboyant designer of gardens and also hotel spaces. So very exotic and very colourful, and quite unique to his own way of working. He's actually British American, working out in the Far East. So a really interesting project to end before coming back to the UK and then being locked down for a while. I had to photograph in spring because in actual fact, the Cherry Avenue is the main feature of the garden, or one of its stunning features. And so I had to plan several gardens, had to travel there, of course. So you're watching many, many different weather forecasts. And so on my phone is covered in weather forecast apps. And I tend to take 3 apps and take an average of what their reading is. They don't all give long range. I use a combination of the Norwegian app, which is yr.no, or there's one called XS, which is very good for wind speed. There's one called AccuWeather, which people will possibly know better, which gives you a bit of a longer term forecast. It's not always accurate, but it gives you some idea of the long-term forecast. So if you're planning several trips in one for a flight or for a long distance location, then this long distance is really helpful. But I tend to look at 3 different apps and make my decision from the best of those 3 at least. So in this case, I was planning for at least this trip to Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, DC, and also to Chanticleer Garden in Pennsylvania. A week before I set off, the head gardener called me and said, "I'm terribly sorry, but the cherry has gone over." Gulp. However, the plum blossom, and those who are horticulturally a little bit more knowledgeable will recognize that this dark red is actually plum blossom. So that was coming out. So actually it wasn't such a bad result after all. So that was okay. So and just to give a broader picture of the garden, perhaps Sophie, you could move on to the next slide. So this is the rose garden. And again, in the very early morning light, and it's just an overview taken from a terrace. Now, a lot of you may have drones now, and there is certainly a very good use for them, especially with getting overviews of gardens. I don't use one, but I may yet be persuaded, I'm sure. But if ever I need an overview, which is almost every garden I go to, I get to the highest point I possibly can and look down. That can be somewhat precarious from various walls and towers of castles, etc., but it's worked so far pretty well. So that gives you a nice overview of the layout of the rose garden. And then moving on, we've got now I believe this is called the Lover's Lane Pool. So this, again, from the highest point, so you've got a sense of place of the pool. I'm not a great fan of using filters. I very, very rarely use filters on my cameras. Occasionally, I might use a polarizing filter, and I think perhaps looking back, I might have just done that on this occasion to get a little bit more detail in the color of the water here. But it's the circular shape that I liked of this, and also with the following shot, Sophie, so leading to the lilac circle on the next image. There we go. And again, it's some really lovely soft light, but the sun just coming up. So depending on what part of the world you're in and what season, but I would hazard a guess this was probably about 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 maybe. sort of in May. Well, it would have been earlier than that, then April, something like that, early in the spring season. So, and moving on from there to Chanticleer Garden, which is in Pennsylvania. I had to throw this one in because I just thought it was the most wonderful tree, which is, it's called a malus, so it's a crab apple, and it's called jewelberry. And this particular tree is mostly white blossom. And the reason that I'm showing it to you is because, again, I can't emphasize enough this use of early morning light, but if that had been shot later in the morning, possibly, even 9 or 10 o'clock, you would have had a lot of contrast, and being white, you would have lost an awful lot of detail in those white petals and blossom, and of the narcissus below. It would have been very blown out, very contrasty. So soft early light, crucial. Okay, so moving on back to the UK, to one of my favourite gardens, which is actually in the Midlands, and much more easy to access. This is Melbourne Hall Gardens in Derbyshire, and this is the Great Basin. And again, I've been working there a lot with the end purpose to produce a book on the gardens, which hopefully we will be working on putting together very soon. And so I've had early access in the gardens for some time now. I first went there 5 years ago, and working on a project for House and Garden, and then seem to have been going back and forth ever since. It's just an absolutely delightful garden with a lot of history and a lot of wonderful horticulture and colourful, painterly beds, very beautifully combined colours in the borders and very beautifully maintained. So this is the Great Basin with the bird cage behind, a historic, iconic building. It's an arbour built by Robert Bakewell, and the helpful swan just happened to be passing by. There's a couple of residents, of course, in the area on that lake. And the temperature of the water in the early morning, of course, very often gives this lovely mist and a bit of atmosphere. So early spring garden in the UK. There we go. And again, a little bit later in the morning, this would have been, so you can see the colour differences and the richness of the tones, but without using filters, but using the foliage to do the work for me and filter for me. The leaves of these limes, the 9 pins as they're called, working their magic by creating a shade over the top of the tulips beneath. There's a lovely urn called the Four Seasons Monument placed behind there, in case you're interested to go and visit. It's really worth it. Good one to go and visit. This is another shot from the same garden, again with the lovely mist. Being that there's so much water in the garden, and this occurs, of course, in gardens with lakes and pools and rivers and mill streams, as this does, but also on island gardens, gardens near the sea particularly. Anywhere where you've got some close proximity to water, you're going to be very well blessed with mist if you get the right climate. Okay, so moving on. A little bit later in the season at the same garden, and with the light coming through from the arboretum. Again, this would have been early in the morning, a little bit later in the season, sort of early June, across the beautiful primulas. It's quite a sea of camasias and different colours. But again, just letting the, from a photographic point of view, avoiding the head-on shot towards the light, but just allowing the foliage to create the shafts of light coming through, and positioning yourself in that area so that you can capture that, and hopefully in a composition that works also within the golden section, roughly speaking, in that case, I hope. So moving on there. Yeah, so explaining a garden within your feature or your story doesn't always mean looking at the garden from within the garden, but sometimes it's really helpful to be able to look out to the garden. And this is a very grand and historic garden, but it might also be through somebody's kitchen window, or you might be looking down from a bedroom window to capture a view. In this case, you've got a lovely, again, sort of historic interior to look out through, but you can see the bird cage at the end of the main lawns there and over the Great Basin. Now, I tend to use a bracketing technique to photograph inside and outside shots. So I'm not a great lover of flash, and also with historic buildings, the curators generally aren't a great fan of flash either. So in this case, I would have, as almost always, used a tripod, but taken several shots of different exposures and then worked post-processing to put them together and merge them at a later date when back in the studio. And then hopefully to effect so that you can get enough of both to get the idea of what looking through the inside to the owner's view to look at their beautiful garden outside might be. So moving on there to, this is a lead in to the work of Tom Stewart-Smith, who's one of the UK's top garden designers, if not the top garden designer. He has a sort of legendary reputation and has produced just this year a lovely book called Drawn from the Land, which I can quickly show you if I can lift it up because it's absolutely huge. But I was fortunate enough to be asked by him to contribute some of the photography. So I was commissioned to take a number of gardens in various locations. This one's in County Durham. It's used in many ways, but it mostly is a wedding venue. So it's a walled garden that has been very beautifully planted and heavily planted with perennial mix. A lot of it seeded, so grown from seed and experimented with different combinations. And again, relying on natural light to highlight the colours and the shapes of the plants, punctuated here, as you can see, with this is an Irish yew, which adds such vertical punctuation. And moving on from there, this is the same garden from a different view. It's quite a classic garden. And you can see the yews as the vertical lines and other trees and this beautiful wrought iron arbour, which I'm sure many wedding vows have been taken beneath. A few more of the same. This is another interesting garden in Dorset. This is Encombe Estate, which is on the edge of almost on the edge of a cliff. So beyond the main garden itself and the main lawns, you've got a sort of infinity drop. So you can see the sea on a clear day from the edge of the garden. It's a big estate, and this little walled garden is situated within a huge meadow within another walled area. So it was quite a challenge to photograph. It's quite a windy spot. I think it was quite, wind was quite an issue. So faster shutter speeds required when it's a bit of a windy day, again, ideally to avoid, but you can't always. So I think wind is one of the elements that I quite enjoy playing with, because sometimes you can actually improve the excitement in your photographs by actually keeping a slower shutter speed and showing some of the movement. But I think within all cases, almost without exception, I would want to keep something sharp. So again, it's absolutely crucial using a tripod. So moving on from there to this is the other view of Encombe House, the beautiful estate. A little bit later in the day, but again quite soft. This time I'm using clouds as my filter. This is disastrous for all filter producers. I'm terribly sorry, but I very, very rarely use anything. Clouds are worth waiting for. Blue skies are wonderful, but I would 9 times out of 10 just wait for that little bit of haze to make a little softer image so I get more detail and I don't get blown out highlights. And also here we've got a bit of reflection on the water. Okay. And I love using trees for framing a subject. So this is the same house, same view from a different angle. The trees, of course, are in a strategically placed landscape position, absolutely beautifully placed, so that you get a view of the house. And also, of course, from the house, you get a view through the lake, through the trees, and eventually to the sea behind where I'm standing there. Again, tripod needed, bit of low light there. I imagine that was evening light there. And also, yeah, just allowing the trees to filter through the light so it's not too harsh and give a little bit of detail within the building right at the end of the focus. Okay, so moving on from there. This is Tom's own garden, which I photographed for House and Garden some years ago. So his own garden with an experimental perennial meadow. And this was one that I was anticipating was going to be disastrous. The garden was always beautiful. There was no question about that. But I stayed there the night before, positioned all my ladders in place. And I can't tell you how much I need ladders for my work, different heights. Position them in different places so that I could get the right angle and the right height to look down. And then when I woke up in the morning early, there was this blanket of thick, thick fog. So could barely see through it. So I thought actually I was rather doomed on this occasion. I knew that I had a limited time because I was supposed to be driving from here in Hertfordshire down to Kew Gardens for another shoot. And to my absolute delight, the light started penetrating through the fog and lifting it just softly enough. We can move on to the next shot, please, Sophie. And the plants started revealing themselves in a rather mysterious way. And I was able to focus on a smaller depth of field here on the actual plants, and then keep the composition by weaving the paths through. And some of the plants were falling over. They're very tall. Tom himself is a very tall guy. And I find in a lot of his gardens, actually, his plants are very tall. Also, I always feel a bit like Alice in Wonderland in some of these gardens. So the light went and it started coming up, and I thought, oh no, I've got to work really quickly. And then another layer of mist descended. It was heavenly. So here we go with some more of his Rudbeckia and various perennial meadow plants, mostly North American plants that he used. There's a whole selection of different Rudbeckias here. And the light just glowed through. So there is always an element of luck with my garden photography, but I think looking back, and again, I have to say planning is so, so important. I've only ever had one photo shoot that actually I really failed on, and I'm afraid that was in Wales, and it absolutely poured with rain. So that was a no-go. But apart from that, over 25 years, I don't think I've ever not successfully completed a photo shoot, and mostly because we, really kept a handle on what's going on with the weather. It's crucial. You have to throw social arrangements, personal things to the wind. I'm afraid they have to go sometimes, and you just have to leg it to the shoot if you know the light's going to be right. So moving on, there we go again. That's the same garden, but again, the winding path, the light was coming through and it was just heavenly. and again. Right, so for the same project, this was another issue where, this is in Spain. So Tom asked me to go and photograph one of the projects that he had worked on in north of Madrid. And this was a wonderful contemporary space. Tom had worked with the garden owner. They had sown the meadow from seed, a beautiful contemporary space. And I really enjoyed looking out through the various window shapes that they had within the building. It was a winemaker's property for a very beautiful wine called Pingus. And the property itself was built by a Danish architect. So there I was in June, waiting to go. It was about 9 o'clock at night. My flight left in the morning, going from Glasgow airport. So I was about to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I got a phone call at 9 o'clock from the owner saying, sorry, the meadow isn't ready yet for you to photograph. It's really not up to speed. It's not right. It would be better to wait 2 or 3 weeks. So bit of a muttering under my breath, but yes, it was worth it. So moving on, I went in a couple of weeks' time, and it was the right decision. A lot of rearranging of flights, etc., etc. And but this is the garden called Granja al Nardo, out in Spain. A beautiful meadow of planted perennials. And that's at sunrise, as you can see. And again, being that it's in Spain, very harsh light from about 8 o'clock onwards in the morning. It's just too bright to photograph. So I think we're probably going to be running out of time, but I just want to try and squeeze one more garden in, if I can, before we run out, which is my project from last year. For Country Life magazine, who we're running can you just hold on to that slide there for a moment, Sophie? They had a guest edited issue, a guest edited by Princess Anne, who had selected her favourite garden in the UK to be photographed for this July issue, 2020. It seemed like a superb, wonderful commission to have, but I had no idea how difficult this was going to be to get to in the middle of lockdown. Not only was it impossible to get there by car because of the ferries weren't running, but even if I had, there was no accommodation and no parking within 2 hours walk to the garden at the lighthouse. It's called Rouval Lighthouse, and it's on the northernmost point of the Isle of Islay in the Western Isles. So in the end, we had to hire a powerboat with 2 crew, big enough to socially distance on board, and that's what we did. So I managed to get out there. The crew were amazing. It was the boat was called the Glenat Castle, and it was a superb rib, which got me there. The guys had a terrible time trying to moor it. They couldn't moor it. The tides were too difficult. The light was great when I got there, and I was so excited. So I managed to get some good garden shots to start with. But then moving on. So this is actually the next morning at dawn. I had to be taken in and out by power dinghy, motor dinghy. And the guys could not moor the boat. The tides were too difficult. And shortly after dawn, we then had thunder and lightning and lashing rain, and it was all weathers in one day. So it was a very interesting trip, but I did manage to succeed with the project. I think you can just about see through the next couple of shots there we go. That's at sunset and sunrise there again, just as I'd been taken ashore from the boat. I think the skipper said at the end of the day he'd never been so tired in his life. That was a long haul. It was a 150-mile round trip from where I live in South Ayrshire, Girvan Harbour, to the northernmost point of Islay, and then a continuous battle with the elements once we were there. But mission accomplished, and the project was done and was published in July last year. Interesting combating the different weathers and trying to capture the light in all these different conditions. And from the sea, of course. A lot more peaceful at that point. So I think we can end there, actually. This is, I think we're going to run out of time otherwise. I just wanted to finish with another shot of beautiful light, which I enjoyed in Italy, again, filtered through the trees. Happy to answer any questions if you wish. I hope I've been able to give you some help with at least some natural techniques, but happy to help in much more detail in the talk itself at the NEC in September. And Sophie, do cut in now if you'd like to, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Andrea. That was so interesting and great to see some wonderful images as well. Just a question that I've got here. Someone would like to know, is there a particular season that you prefer shooting in? And if so, why?
Well, it's usually the one I'm in. I would say there are two seasons. I love autumn. I love the wind down season. And actually, we could just show a quick picture. If you move on about 3 or 4 pictures from that, I don't know if you are able to, Sophie, but I did, this is autumn pictures from a garden in New Jersey. But if you move on to the next one there, this is a local garden to me. It's called Logan Botanic Gardens. It's just south of Stranraer, on that southwesterly peninsula of Scotland. And I photographed this in November with a dear friend and on the day, a student, Tom Atwood. And again, in November, the light can be wonderful. It can be gloomy, of course, but I think making good use of gloom is a wonderful thing. And when you get through a gloomy day, that flash of light that comes through the clouds, then that's really quite precious. So I'd sort of say winter, autumn going through to winter. Winter is very good in a commercial respect, because if you photograph a good garden in winter, then for a magazine or on spec, then if it works really well, it's very precious to capture a good garden in snow at that right moment when there's not been trodden on, it's not been mushy. That feels like a prize if you capture that just right. I think there is one. I think if you move on a little bit towards the end of, if you just sort of flip through a couple, I think I can show you one of my favourite gardens. There's a lovely dishevelled garden, which is in Ireland, Altamont. But moving on from there, this one at Rosneath is a beautiful winter garden, which it took 4 trips. It's up near Helensburgh, Rosneath. It's a good couple of hours, if not more, to drive to for me. And I stayed overnight at the hospitality of the owners, and they were so patient and helpful for me. But trying to get that early morning mist and then frost, timing it is really hard. So it took several tries, but it was worth it, because if you look at the next slide, I think you can see what the garden looked like below. And it was an absolutely beautiful topiary garden with wonderful structure, which of course is what you want from a winter garden.
Amazing. So just a question that we have from, we've got lots of lovely comments, Andrea, as well. We have a question from Anne-Marie who said, stunning images, what equipment do you use?
Right, well, I use Nikon. I use a Nikon 850, and I've got an 810 in reserve. And I use a 24 to 70 zoom a lot of the time, and a 105 macro for close-ups. And then I've got a much wider zoom as well, and a 400mm long lens that I use. That's my basic kit that I take with me. I've other bits and pieces that I like to take, but that's the basic kit that I would take. I can't tell you how much, as I mentioned, I take a step ladder with me whenever possible. And if I'm traveling abroad and you can't do that, of course, first thing I do if I get off the plane is go and find a DIY home base or Home Depot and find a step ladder.
Lovely. Also, we've got a question here. So for anyone starting out in photography, do you have any advice for finding your niche?
That's a really good one. And the niche is crucial. I couldn't agree more. And I was so lucky to find my niche. I think you've got to really find what you enjoy. If you enjoy the subject or you're interested in the subject, you are going to produce better results. So whatever it might be, I mean, mine, obviously, I love plants and gardens, and I love the detail, and I always have, and nature. But, you know, it might be parts of a motorbike, or it might be, you know, cars or planes, whatever. And if it's airplanes you like, then photograph airplanes, because you're going to get a better result and you'll be able to enjoy working with them on the long term.
Amazing, thank you. And I'm just going to take one last question. So you mentioned, obviously, that you buy ladders when you go on to different shoots as well, but just it would be great to know how do you plan your shoots, and do you have a crew with you? Is it just yourself? And are your shoots always weather dependent?
Yeah, shoots are very usually weather dependent, and or rather it's my job to make sure that I get the right place at the right time. That's my responsibility. I usually work on my own. I like to work on my own, actually, but I have worked with assistants in the past, particularly when I used to do some very large format work, which I really enjoyed. I love dabbling with old processes. And I did at one point have I borrowed, I didn't own it, but it was a big 20-inch plate camera, which, if you can imagine how big a negative is this size. So for photographing with that particular piece of equipment, I had two supports for the bellows in front of it. So yes, I did have an assistant for that sort of a shoot. I photographed the Lost Gardens of Heligan using that camera, in actual fact, which was great fun. But normally I work on my own. My other latest piece of kit is a camper van. So I have found that, especially through the pandemic, you know, I needed to have my own accommodation with me, so I wasn't imposing myself on other people or going into hotels which, you know, I wasn't quite sure about doing. So I bought a camper van, a VW camper van, and that now means also that I'm in the gardens at the crack of dawn, which is wonderful. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So thank you so much today, Andrea. Thanks for that session. I know that you'll be joining us in September at the photography show and the video show. Where else can people find you, Andrea?
Well, socially, sort of on Instagram and on Facebook and Twitter. So by all means, keep an eye on that. But I look forward to meeting people in person at the NEC. And of course, I can go into an awful lot more detail about equipment and techniques face to face at that point. So I'd be very happy to help people. So do come to that.
We look forward to seeing you there. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you for another virtual session very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.